In this section, we will examine the philosophy of René Descartes in general terms. Descartes, who is considered the pioneer of modern philosophy and modern thought, will be examined around his understanding of method and metaphysics. Born in France in 1596, René Descartes is considered one of the most important philosophers not only of his own time, but of the entire history of philosophy. Descartes, who made great discoveries and innovations in the fields of mathematics, science and philosophy, wrote many works in these fields. Descartes, who was educated at the Jesuit College of La Flèche between 1604 and 1612, later chose a military career and served in various armies. However, he spent most of his military years in winter camps, where armies rested during the winter months. He generally spent the winter days, which were a complete period of stagnation for the armies at that time, thinking and studying. After leaving the military in 1621, Descartes embarked on a long journey, travelling to countries such as Germany, Holland and Italy, and finally settled in Paris, France. However, when he could not find a quiet and peaceful working environment in Paris, he left France in 1629 and settled in Holland. He wrote his most important studies and works in Holland, where he lived for 20 years. Invited to Stockholm in 1649 by Queen Christina of Sweden, Descartes began giving private philosophy lessons to the Queen. Descartes, who spent the last years of his life in Stockholm, contracted pneumonia in Sweden's cold climate and died in 1650. Descartes is one of the most important philosophers of the period known as the New Age. The rational philosophical approach, which is common to almost all New Age philosophers and originates from mathematics and physics, is often referred to as Cartesian rationalism or Cartesian philosophy with reference to his name. Besides this, Descartes is considered the first of modern philosophers, even the founder of modern philosophy. In other words, modern philosophy usually refers to the philosophical current that continued from Descartes onwards. One of the important and justified reasons for this is that Descartes tried to establish a new philosophical system in line with this, instead of adopting the principles put forward by the great thinkers before him. Another reason that can be given is that he embarked on a search for a new, solid and reliable method to be able to establish this philosophical system. In short, Descartes tried to make philosophy an exact science. This effort of Descartes has been a common effort of many important philosophers up to the present day. According to Descartes, although the thinkers before him had been pursuing knowledge and truth for centuries, there are very few points that are beyond doubt among the results they have reached. According to him, one of the most important reasons for this is that the mind is not used correctly. That is, the appropriate method is not followed in the search for knowledge. Descartes saw the method as a prerequisite for seeking the truth. In his work titled Rules for the Direction of the Mind, he expressed his thoughts on the method as follows. What I mean by method is certain and easy to apply rules. Those who follow these do not accept wrong as right, and without thinking in vain about everything they can know, they constantly increase their knowledge step by step and reach the correct information. The first principle that comes to mind when we say the method followed by Descartes is the principle known as Cartesian doubt. In fact, this principle of doubt is not the method itself, but a part of it, and can be seen as a preparation for the process of reaching reliable information. Descartes accepted that he had to doubt everything first in order to build a solid and reliable foundation for his philosophy. For this, until one reaches a single thing that cannot be doubted, that can be grasped clearly and distinctly, all known things must be accepted as wrong and set aside. Descartes expressed this view as follows. I thought that I must necessarily reject as false all the things of which I could have the least doubt, to see if there remained anything among my opinions which was so evident and certain that it could not be doubted. Descartes continues this process of doubt, which is a preliminary preparation, by putting aside all his previous ideas, judgments and information, no matter what they are based on, because they are doubtful. At the end of this process, he reaches a point where he cannot doubt. I can doubt everything, but I cannot doubt that I am doubting. Descartes was a great mathematician as well as a great philosopher and made important contributions to this field. However, he argued that the specific method of mathematics should be applied in all sciences. Descartes actually gathered all the sciences under the roof of philosophy. According to him, philosophy is like a tree whose roots are metaphysics, whose trunk is physics, and whose branches are other sciences. Therefore, although there are differences between them, there should be only one scientific method that is valid for all sciences, and this method is mathematics. Therefore, Descartes saw the mathematical method as an indispensable element in order to reveal his philosophy clearly and soundly. In his work titled Discourse on the Method, he said the following about mathematics. I was especially delighted with mathematics because of the certainty and evidence of its reasonings, but I had not as yet a precise knowledge of its true use, and thinking that it was useful only in mechanics, I was astonished that foundations so strong and solid should have had no loftier superstructure reared on them. For this reason, Descartes tried to do what had not been done before, putting aside traditional methods, and thought that the mathematical method should be applied to philosophy in order to make philosophy an exact science. According to Descartes, traditional logic is a method that is insufficient to discover unknown things and serves more to explain known things to others rather than to teach something new. Moreover, according to Descartes, traditional logic contains many harmful and unnecessary rules as well as many correct and useful rules. As a result, Descartes put aside the rules that make up traditional logic and decided to strictly adhere to the following 4 rules in his own thinking process. The first was never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid precipitancy and prejudice, and to comprise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. The second, to divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible and as might be necessary for its adequate solution. The third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend by degrees, and as it were step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex, assigning in thought a certain order, even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in a relation of antecedence and sequence. And the last, in every case to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. As can be seen, the method that Descartes reduced to these 4 rules can be seen largely as an application in the field of philosophy of the analysis and synthesis methods used by mathematicians in their own fields. Accordingly, complex and difficult to understand propositions are analysed and reduced step by step to simpler propositions and finally to basic propositions. Then, starting from these simplest propositions, the information at hand is synthesized and new information is reached step by step. According to Descartes, mathematics is a method in itself, independent of the mathematical objects it deals with, for example, geometric shapes and numbers. Therefore, this method can be used not only for the objects of mathematics, but also universally in all branches of science and philosophy. For this reason, Descartes calls this mathematical method universal mathematics, mathesis universalis, in his work titled Rules for the Direction of the Mind. Descartes expressed the idea that this mathematical method is quite reliable and efficient in reaching new information with the following words. Those long chains of reasoning, quite simple and easy, which geometers are wont to employ in the accomplishment of their most difficult demonstrations, had led me to think that everything which might fall under the cognizance of man might very likely be mutually related in the same fashion, and that, provided we abstain from receiving anything as true which is not so, and always preserve in our thoughts the necessary order for deducing one truth from another, there would be none so remote at which we might not at last arrive, nor so concealed which we might not discover. As can be seen, Descartes placed mathematics, that is, the mathematical method, at the centre of philosophy. In this respect, two basic assumptions of the Cartesian method can be mentioned. The first is that nothing that is not clear and distinct should be accepted as true. The second is that nothing that is not in mathematical form should be accepted as certain. These methodological assumptions put forward by Descartes have had a great influence both in his own time and in later periods, both in the field of philosophy and science. We saw that Descartes determined the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," as a clear and certain principle that cannot be doubted. Descartes built his philosophy step by step, starting from this principle. At this point, Descartes knows only one thing: I am. It is clear that I am thinking and that I exist, but it is not yet clear that the object of my thought, that is, the things I think about, also exist outside of me. It is possible that I may have arrived at these thoughts because my senses are deceiving me, or that this idea is entirely a product of my imagination. Moreover, there may even be a malicious and deceptive supernatural being that makes me fall into such a delusion. For example, I can imagine a winged horse, but just because I am thinking of a winged horse does not mean that such a thing really exists. Descartes thought that if he did not have another idea that did not originate from himself and was clearly coming from elsewhere, he would remain enclosed within the proposition, "I think, therefore I am," and would not be able to take another step, doubting everything else. Therefore, he needed another clear idea. This idea is the idea of God or a perfect being. According to Descartes, the idea of God cannot be a product of my thought because my thought is finite and limited. It is not possible for an infinite consequence to emerge from a finite and limited cause. Therefore, God necessarily exists, and the idea of God in me was given to me by God himself. Descartes, in his works titled Meditations on First Philosophy, so Meditations and Principles of Philosophy, presented many proofs as to why God must necessarily exist. It is very important for Descartes that we do not doubt the existence of God, because every truth, every certainty, and every positive science depends on it. If the existence of God were not a certain and clear piece of knowledge, we would not be able to go a step beyond the knowledge of "I think, therefore I am." In other words, we would know ourselves, but we would not know anything else. But when we know that God exists, this knowledge will also give us the possibility of knowing objects outside of ourselves. Descartes expresses this thought in his work titled Meditations on First Philosophy. Meditations, as follows. After I knew that God existed, and that my mind depends on him, and that he is not a deceiver, I also knew that everything which I understand clearly and distinctly is necessarily true. No opposing reason can be shown which could lead me to doubt it, and so I have a true and certain knowledge of it. And this knowledge also encompasses all the other things that have been proven before, such as the truths of geometry and other similar things. Thus, I clearly understand that the certainty and truth of a science depends only on the knowledge of God, so much so that I could not fully know anything else before I knew him. And now that I know him, I have the opportunity to acquire knowledge not only about God himself and other intellectual things, but also about many things found in physical nature. At this point, Descartes thinks that he has three certain pieces of knowledge. The first is I am. The second is God exists. The third is the world of bodies that exist outside of me. These can be briefly defined as follows. God is an infinite substance whose existence depends on nothing but himself, to whom all things are related. The mind is a thinking substance. The body is an extended substance. As can be seen, according to Descartes, we can talk about three substances: God, mind, and body. However, Descartes considers God as the absolute substance and the mind and body as relative substances because, according to Descartes, a substance is something that does not need anything other than itself to exist. That is, the reason for its existence is within itself, but the mind and body were created by God and are therefore dependent on Him. Therefore, the concept of substance does not mean the same thing when used for God and created things. In other words, according to Descartes, God, who is not dependent on anything, is the absolute substance, while the mind and body are relatively substances because they are dependent not on other created things, but only on God. According to Descartes, the essence or fundamental attribute of bodies is extension. In the universe there can be neither an extension without a body, that is, a void, nor a body that does not occupy space, that is, an atom. The universe of bodies is limitless because a limited extension is inconceivable. The fundamental property of extension is motion, but the source of motion cannot be in the bodies themselves. It cannot even be said that bodies move because bodies only occupy space. Because they are completely passive, they can only be moved by an external influence. Therefore, bodies can be likened to machines that operate entirely mechanically and necessarily. According to Descartes, this is true not only for inanimate bodies but also for animals and humans. All living and non-living beings in nature are subject to the same laws because they have the same structure. The only difference between living bodies and inanimate bodies is that living bodies have a more complex functioning than inanimate bodies. In Descartes' words, living beings are nothing more than perfect machines created by God. On the other hand, the essence of minds is thought. In essence, the mind is the exact opposite of the body. Minds are not passive and necessarily functioning substances like bodies, but active and free substances. Just as there can be nothing in the body that does not occupy space and is not material, there can be nothing in the mind that does not think, occupy space, and is material. In other words, the body is absolutely immaterial and the mind is absolutely immaterial or non-physical. This thought of Descartes that there are two different substances, that is, this distinction he makes between mind and body, is called substance dualism in the history of philosophy. From this, Descartes arrives at the idea that there must also be a distinction between the physical sciences and the mental sciences. According to Descartes, just as there is no common ground between body and mind in essence, there can be no talk of a common ground between the sciences related to bodies and the sciences related to the mind. Because the mind and body are substances of completely different kinds, the truths pertaining to each must be derived from the nature of that substance. Therefore, just as physical science must remain within and be interpreted within mechanical limits, so too must mental science be done by explaining it in terms of the mind itself. An important consequence that can be drawn from this understanding of Descartes is that it is out of the question for the clergy to interfere with scientists or physicists. Likewise, it is not possible for scientists or physicists to make judgments about the soul. Therefore, just as there can be no conflict between religion and science, there can be no interaction at the level of ideas. The separation of mind and body, that is essential dualism, also applies when it comes to humans. According to Descartes, there can be no interaction between two substances whose basic attributes are completely opposite to each other. Therefore, although man exists as a unity and integrity of mind and body, neither the mind can affect the body, nor the body can affect the mind in any way. The body has its own laws, and the mind has its own laws. In a letter, Descartes explains the separation between body and mind as follows: "Those who have never philosophized and have only used their senses suppose that the soul moves the body,